Um, Probably Ivan, to this audience, Ivan probably needs no introduction, but in case you haven't met him, this is Ivan Diaz-Rainey from the Department of Accountancy and Finance. The reason we know him is he's been around OERC, Otago Energy Research Centre, for quite a while, just stepped down as co-convener. So it's our pleasure to have him kind of do his maybe swan song.
So you're not planning on having me back? Probably just as well after this presentation.
So what I'm going to talk to us about is this is an energy policy presentation and learnings from the EU for the Asian group. So take it away, Ivan.
Thank you, Michael. I hope it's not my last presentation to OERC. Yes, it does have the Department of Accounting and Finance. It's not explicitly accounting and finance research. It's also very high-level research. It's not. I mean, it's a really book chapter. So let me give you a bit of context about that in a second. Involves various co-authors, a couple of people at Otago, Decar, who's actually joining us today. Pick him up at the airport later today. Matt at Oxford and Farad at Waseda in Japan. So this really came about because I saw this call from the Asian Development Bank Institute, and it was really asking about sort of comparing and contrasting experiences of economic integration across Europe and Asia. And I've been traveling a bit around Asia, and I'm quite fascinated, in particular the ASEAN region. And I thought, well, what about energy policy? Europe, are there lessons from EU energy policy for the ASEAN grouping? The chapter that is behind this presentation has been submitted to this call. Still don't have a decision, but hopefully they like it. The title says an energy policy for ASEAN. And so the first part of the title really is a reference to a document in 2007 by the EU Commission called An Energy Policy for Europe. And so this was really quite an important document because you'd had EU growing influence of the EU in energy policy, in environmental policy, in issues of energy security, and there was a sort of feeling that it was all a bit disjointed. So you had that trilemma, and you felt like environmental policy was pushing in one direction. The idea of creating a single European energy market was doing its own thing, and you also had energy security pushes to try and create a single European energy policy or energy security policy. And what an energy policy for Europe did, as far as I'm concerned, was really try and sort of create a coordinated approach to the trilemma. And I think it was a very good document in that respect. It also had something called that should be 2020. I stepped in for someone else who was meant to be here this today a month early, so the slides were just being done before I came here, but it should be, say, 2020 ×3 package. Okay, and so that set EU targets both for renewables, energy efficiency, and CO2 reductions. And so I guess one of the things I'm putting up here is Europe as a bit of an exemplar. So this is from European Union data on how they were doing on their 2020 ×3. So in terms of cutting the greenhouse gases by 20%. By 2020, and this was data to 2016. Well, they'd already achieved the cut by 2016. So Europe had exceeded its target by 2016. I don't know how far below it is now. I think there's quite a lag in measuring this data. I'm sure Ben will be able to tell me probably quite more precisely. There was also meant to be a cut in energy efficiency. Relative to probably a 1990 baseline, I suspect, of 20%. And then on the top line, the blue line, there was the idea of growing renewables as part of total energy from just under 9% to 20% by 2020. Yeah? I don't know how they got these targets to work. It was very neat, 2020 times 3, yeah? 20%, 20%, 20%. They must have fudged the numbers to make it work that nicely, yeah? The real world doesn't work so neatly, yeah? So actually, if you look at the energy efficiency one, it was really a 13% reduction relative to 2005. So, but you know, 2020 times 3 sounded really great, yeah? Put 2020 times x3 into Google now, you get a BMW, which is a real shame, yeah? Pictures of a BMW. Okay, so yeah, I would say the EU has done really well, yeah, and you've got those 3 facets. Focus on carbon emissions, which you might just say that was EU ETS, and a whole load of policies on energy efficiency, and then a whole load of policies on renewables. So, you know, 3 elements to it. And also, sort of as a bit of a side, you know, I guess, well, you know, EU is made up of a number of countries, and the UK is one of them. And this isn't in the chapter, but it was out the other day from the new UK green energy strategy, and you see that UK has cut emissions by 42%. Yeah, so it's probably the standout performer in terms of the EU, and also I think it's really relevant in terms of the growth and greening debate. Yeah, I still hear a lot of people saying, "Oh, we have to stop growth." Well, look at that, 72% GDP growth over that period from 1990, and emissions caught for 42. Yeah, so we've decoupled emissions from we've decoupled growth from emissions. Yeah. And I think it's really relevant in the context of ASEAN, yeah, because one of the objections a lot of these high-growth developing countries have towards energy transition is that it's going to limit their growth. Yeah, and you look at that, and the answer is comprehensively no. It won't limit your growth necessarily. So there's Razuk, who's an energy analyst, or in particular a renewables expert, sort of made the observation up there. I'll let you read it. But basically, he's saying the ASEAN region has been you know, he made the statement that they've been a bit of a laggard. And so this caught my attention. And as I said, I've been traveling in the region as well. And we all know China is really the renewables energy superpower. So you would have thought that that's quite a surprising statement. You would have thought that would have rubbed off to some of the ASEAN region. But, you know, he seems to be, from what I'm going to show you, basically accurate. And clearly, ASEAN will have growing demand for energy, estimated at 5% through to 2023. And of course, access to energy is a big issue. So from this chapter, really what we're looking to ask is, you know, how can ASEAN advance its trilemma through greater energy cooperation, as I've hinted that the EU has done, and I'll talk more about how the EU has done that. And are there any specific lessons from the EU? But, you know, before we go into too much detail in terms of the comparison, it's really important to know, really, in a sense, we're comparing apples and pears a wee bit, yeah? Because EU is a supranational organization. It has a parliament, it has a commission and a council, which act as quasi-executives. Yeah, so we're talking about a supranational organization versus an intergovernmental organization. But, you know, those are fundamental differences. But it's interesting, the way they frame their energy policies or cooperation, it sounds and looks very similar. But, you know, this difference makes a huge difference. The fact that we have treaties, you know, the idea of subsidiarity in Europe, that just isn't there in ASEAN. But, you know, despite those key differences, I hope I can highlight to you that there's some useful lessons. If this is a finance audience, I'd probably need to spend the next 20 minutes talking about this. You guys know, yeah? You know what a smart grid is, you know, demand response, grid edge technologies, a less linear architecture to the energy system or storage. You know, this is actually quite an old smart grid picture because I don't see any EVs in there. Yeah, no, you know, vehicle to grid and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, you guys are pretty well versed. So, you know, we have energy transition. You see pictures like this, and they sort of belie the fact that there are actually very contrasting visions of what this transition could look like. And so there is a techno-social literature that looks at different transition pathways. So we've got, that comes from work from Verbo, Giels, and Battaglini and others. And yeah, they're really quite different visions of energy transition. So the first one would be transformation, or the hybrid smart grid. And really this is where the government, you still broadly defined by nation states. Yeah. Then you have the sort of reconfiguration, a super smart grid. And so this is where countries become increasingly interconnected. And so the great advantage there is that it helps to address the intermittency issue. If the sun isn't shining in southern Europe, the wind will be blowing in the north, etc. So, this implies a lot more HVDC. It probably implies a lot more markets, because you need to be sending the right signals about transmitting power across different borders. And then you have what I would call the blue skin peg solution. Yeah. It's just, let's have a microgrid, let's disconnect, and so on. Yeah? And so those are three very different transition pathways. So we're looking at this ASEAN issue from these three techno-social views of energy transition. And to be honest, I'm painting them as mutually exclusive, and the punchline is going to be a non-mutually exclusive, actually. So let's talk about EU energy policy and integration. So really, there's been a big push towards transition pathway 2, so the super smart grid, getting the whole of Europe connected. So European electricity markets have really been regional for quite some time, and they really want to make them truly pan-European. And those regional markets have grown, so they're got bigger and bigger. And then the idea is just to have one large super smart grid for the whole of Europe that is interconnected and helps to deal with this intermittency issue. Yeah. So it also represents the alignment of markets and decarbonisation. Again, probably not a popular thing amongst OERC. There's a lot of the OERC crowd, but yeah, it's definitely the alignment of the two. The other thing, and an issue that I find frustrating, is around this whole decarbonisation agenda in Europe. There's so much emphasis placed on EU ETS, and a lot of talk about carbon prices having been very low. And so a lot of negative talk. And so it's sort of a real distraction, because what has really driven, I think, those changes that we saw in that first chart, so the progress that Europe has made, is a whole of really boring stuff, regulations, directives that have been done across other areas. So, we have a ETS, but, the whole energy sector is being restructured. And so this is really work from my ex-PhD, Dan Tulloch. And so there's a whole push for the internal energy market, so a single electricity market, coming from the idea of the Treaty of Rome, that, we would have single markets in Europe. But there's been an energy efficiency stream, and this is probably the biggest unsung hero of the whole thing. It doesn't really get that much attention. And so, I don't know, when I do get quoted about New Zealand energy policy, I say we need sectoral policies. We don't just need carbon prices. And it's exactly these sort of things that I mean. So, directives, market transformation on renewable energies and energy efficiency. We've also had an energy security stream. I mean, there isn't a common EU defence policy, which would really require a full energy security policy, but there have been directives that have addressed this issue. So in terms of the greening, and so that alignment between the market and the environmental motivation for energy policy, it's these three: the internal market, energy efficiency, and renewable energy legislation and directives that are really important. So Dan did his thesis here with us, and he looked at all the directives in those four streams: energy efficiency, renewable, security, and single market. And he found between 1999 and 2013, there were 54 directives or regulations in this area. The largest number of directives were on energy efficiency. Yeah? So when people complain that carbon prices were really low and carbon markets are a failure, Well, actually, one reason carbon prices were so low in Europe is because all these other policies were so damn successful, yeah, at cutting energy demand. And you also had policies that incentivized renewables. Yeah. But in particular in energy efficiency, you've had a whole load of regulations starting from 2002, maybe even before, on the energy efficiency of buildings. I think we had Virginia, not Virginia, Helen Vickers. I think she presented a few years back to OERC, and she said, I don't know, our building code is equivalent to Europe. I don't remember. Maybe Michael, do you remember? It's probably Europe in the 1990s, yeah? So -20, okay. I have to live in New Zealand, so, you know, you go back to Europe soon. So -20, okay. I was going to say 70s, but I didn't want to be dramatic, okay. Yeah, it is 1970s, okay. Yeah, so when I say to people the buildings here could be improved radically, and they tell me the building code has improved markedly, I'm thinking, well, you know, that's from a very low base, yeah? And, you know, this is the hero of this boring legislation on buildings, on labeling of appliances, on product design. You're actually banning products that aren't energy efficiency. So, you know, EU put all these directives, and then actually Dan's work, he looked at how these directives affected the prices of energy utilities on the stock market. And it's the energy efficiency stuff that really killed those utilities. Every time a new directive like this came out, it was a negative effect on their stock price because there was going to be less demand for their products. Yeah. So cogeneration. So I think roughly, I don't know, I can't remember the exact numbers, but you know, somewhere roughly half of those directives, or slightly less than half, were around energy efficiency, and that's only covering up to 2013. You also had less directives, but important directives on renewables. They set targets for renewables across Europe. They set incentives, or they didn't set incentives. They tried to ensure a level playing field across incentives in Europe. So feed-in tariffs versus green certification markets, that sort of thing. They created rules about grid access and priority. So that's really important. States that didn't want renewables could make access to the grid difficult, and the EU made sure that that didn't happen. Yeah. There was also directives on biofuels. Just for completeness, there were directives on energy security, as I said. They really focused on storage of oil and gas and the ability for the EU to intervene in times of crisis. In fact, even intervene in terms of setting prices and so on. The other really critical one is a single market, because if we do want to deal with intermittency issue, then the bigger the network, the bigger the supergrid, the better. And there's been 3 packages. So the first package in 1997, so which was a whole load of directives that tried to create better grid access for competitors, interconnectors across country, unbundling of the sector, so vertical disintegration, ensuring competition at wholesale and ultimately retail level, and creating regulatory agencies to ensure that there was a regulator to make sure that there was a sort of fair playing field, yeah, in terms of access and in terms of how market participants behaved in the market. So ACER, oh gosh, I've forgotten what it stands for, but it's like a EU level energy regulator. And actually, this is not in a paper. EU, have you seen this, Ben? The EU's come up with this new tool to chart, you can chart natural gas assets, oil assets, smart grid, CO2 projects. But I've clicked on sort of high volt HVDC lines, storage, and so on, and smart grid projects. And what you see, so they call these ongoing. I'm not really sure what they mean. So, I mean, there's even a wee wire there going off up to Iceland. I don't know if they're actually going to build that. So, well, no, these are planned. So what they're saying is these are planned. I should have the ones that exist, and there's very little blue. But the planned ones, there's an awful lot there. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if this is how real this is, but bringing presumably solar power from Israel to Europe, bringing presumably concentrated solar power from Tunisia. But, you know, there's plenty of actual HVDC lines being built within Europe, yeah? So, you know, there's within the European Union a whole load of HVDC lines. You can click on the existing power grid and then it becomes a bit of a mess, but this is just highlighting the HVDC. Yeah, so, you know, HVDC is high voltage. You can transport power long distances, put it into the rest of the power grid and help transport, power to help deal with this intermittency issue. So yeah, I was quite surprised how much blue was up there.
It's worth saying that Germany, for example, is using France's method in order to switch its own off.
Yeah.
So there's a whole lot of politics involved in this as well.
Yeah.
So the intermittency is not quite what Germany's worried about. It's more where we're going to get the power from because we're switching our own nuclear off.
Right. Okay. Yeah. That's okay. So they're switching their own off, but buying the French nuclear power. Right. And presumably you want a nice big HVDC line to be able to do that. Yeah. Look, I think if you talk about the whole experience of EU, we've had 3 packages, yeah, and there's talk of a 4th package. I don't know where we are with that, but you know, it's been 2 steps forward, 1 step back. You know, when they did the first package, they probably thought that was going to be it, and they had to come up and create new rules. You know, it's a game of perseverance, but I don't know. I think it's been relatively successful. Let's check how I'm doing with time. Racing through it. Okay, so ASEAN, so I know less, so I've known quite a bit about the EU context, and as I said, I travelled to various ASEAN countries. I like their dynamism, but I was intrigued by the fact that they were apparently so slow to embrace the renewables and energy revolution. Clearly, there's been an ASEAN plan for action for energy cooperation starting in 1999. So really, you know, around the time that, you know, EU efforts to collaborate start. And so not far behind. And they've had 4 plans. The plans talk about an ASEAN power grid, so that sounds very much like lots of HVDC, interconnected, a trans-ASEAN gas pipeline, coal and clean coal technology, energy efficiency conservation, renewable energy, regional energy policy and planning, and civilian nuclear energy. But, you know, so on the face of it, it looks like there's a lot there. The reality is, given the nature of the ASEAN grouping, that any progress on integration tends to fall down to bilateral type agreements. So then you go down to the next level and you look at country level policies. And so IRENA has, International Renewable Energy Association has a database of energy policies around the world. And so again, we sent a very rough first draft of this chapter, so we want to look into this in a lot more detail. But you know, there was very little in terms of providing incentives for renewables till the late 2000s. So we've had some feed-in tariffs, some feed-in premiums, some national development plans with targets or incentives. Oh, I'm missing one there. Last-minute slides, but I think it was, I can't remember, one of the smaller ASEAN countries. But so you've got feed-in tariffs in the Philippines introduced in 2012. Thailand introduced some in 2013-14 for distributed power, which kind of superseded some earlier feed-in premiums in 2007. Malaysia also introduced a feed-in tariff in 2001. Yeah. But you know, when you think by the 2000s, every EU member state needed to have some sort of incentive program for renewables, then yeah, it's a good decade behind. Yeah, and some countries have very little or nothing at all in terms of incentivizing renewables. Of course, there are much poorer countries, you know, with budgets that are under a lot more pressure and with populations that you know, have very low incomes and so on. So I don't want to be unduly critical, but you know. So here's some data we got from the IEA. So there's quite a lag, and it goes to 2016. And so we looked at sort of wind energy across the ASEAN countries, and really Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam a little bit, but really I think, if I remember, the largest, I can't remember exactly, but I calculated it in the paper, but it was about 2 or 3%, the largest in terms of relative to total load. When you compare that to Denmark, which is in the 40, 50s or whatever it is, yeah. So wind is way behind. Solar, sort of similar story. Thailand seems to, and it's the countries that have those incentives that are up there. Yeah, the clear takeaway. Thailand has some solar. Philippines had incentives. Malaysia has incentives. So you create incentives, you get a bit of diffusion, as we call it, market diffusion. Next, I tried to create a sort of a measure of how much these countries are integrated. Yeah, and so I took the absolute value of imports and exports. I sort of added them up, and then I sort of do so that gives you an absolute level of import and export. So that's on the left hand scale, and then relative to gross production on the right hand side. I guess that was the 1979 oil crisis, where I guess production went down, and then there was maybe more import and export. But you do see that there is more interconnectors between ASEAN countries. Yeah, so there is, despite the fact that there isn't this supranational organization, there is this upward trend in terms of trading electricity across borders. So there is a movement towards greater integration. And as you might know, there's lots of, let's say, exciting proposals out there. So this is talk of the ASEAN Supergrid, Asian, sorry. So it's broader than just ASEAN. There's also the idea of taking renewables from Australia and bring them into Asia. I think there's some quite serious money going into exploring these possibilities. Yeah, I mean, we know that there's talk about a global grid, and so if you start thinking about a global grid, then this suddenly doesn't look so ambitious, but yeah, it's still hugely challenging. Huge amount of capital is going to be needed, and yeah, I don't know if you know, today Australia's created a commission to look at nuclear power, so maybe the current government isn't too serious about this. Given where costs of renewables are, I'm not really sure. So there's one HVDC line at the moment. Sorry, I think it's B there. Yeah, that's A. Sorry, yeah, between Thailand and Malaysia. Yeah, so yeah. Interconnector. But yeah, clearly the potential for a lot more. But these economies have been growing and installing a lot of coal plants, and there are the CO2 emissions from fossil fuel combustion. Yeah. So you compare that to what's been happening in Europe. Obviously, they need to keep growing, but as I showed you in the UK, you can continue to grow and reduce your carbon emissions. Yeah. There's a wee blip for that would be the Asian financial crisis. I would have thought there. Nothing like a crisis to help a bit of do that curve, but yeah, they have an issue. That's to 2016. And so next we sort of look at sort of carbon pricing, and one of the things is that one of the reasons I like going there, it's a really dynamic economy. So they incredibly hardworking people. They want to improve themselves. So I think if Razuk said, look, they've been a laggard, but they're starting to wake up to this, and the very last slide is going to show what's happened in Vietnam in the last year. But in terms of carbon pricing, so there's been no carbon pricing. Only Singapore has a carbon price, and that was introduced this year, and at the lofty price of $4 a ton. Yeah. So Thailand and Vietnam are considering carbon pricing. And then the next bit is the generating units. This is work done by Matt, who is one of the authors. They did a project, I think it was HSBC that sponsored it. So investors are really interested in the idea of a stranded asset. Yeah. So you've had all these generating plants installed across Asia. So these are the current ones, these are the planned, and those are the total ones. And they computed something called carbon locking curves. So, you know, which of these plants are inconsistent with 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees? I don't have the 2 degrees, but I reproduced the 1.5 degrees. And so the fact that they're a laggard, and so, you know, we say that if we don't act, the pain is going to be a lot harder in the future. And this really exemplifies that. Because they've been slow, you know, we're talking countries, big countries like Indonesia, you know, 89% of their plant is inconsistent with 1.5 degrees. If you go to 2 degrees, it's slightly better, but it's still a hell of a lot. Yeah? So that's saying these plants will have to be closed down well before their, you know, normal economic useful life. Yeah, so I think coal is 40, 50 years, gas is 25, something like that. People in the room that could tell me for sure, yeah. So that's a lot of stranded assets, yeah. So if they do start transitioning quickly, there's a problem. If they don't, there's a problem, yeah. So I'm a real optimist here, yeah. So yeah, definitely having a whole lot of stranded assets, by the way, is definitely my preferred solution. But you know, you need to think about this. Yeah. One of the good things is that actually in Europe, what they did is they privatized and unbundled and, you know, created markets. I think, imagine the state. This is something I want to look at more. Is the state still controls a lot of these companies? So maybe the state can wear a lot of these costs. Yeah. If it was private investors, then you get into a really much harder game, because they're going to come and negotiate hard, saying, well, and should you really be bailing them out? Unless you've been living in the cave, then, you know, you should have been aware that you know, with climate change, and these may not be, you know, I mean, anybody doing these should definitely not be getting bailed out. Yeah, I mean, the question is, yeah, but they can create real losses and create real financial problems. So to conclude, ASEAN is an intergovernmental organization, so it ultimately boils down to bilateral agreements. But I still think that if they have a more coordinated approach, they could do a lot more on this space. So, you know, we need to look at it more, but like, for instance, on the energy efficiency side, on the product policy side, could they set, you know, ASEAN product policy standards? Because if you set product policy standards for the whole of the ASEAN region, that's going to have a powerful effect. Yeah. So by that I mean, if, you know, your fridge needs to be a certain level of efficiency, if your cars need to be a certain level of efficiency, well, if Singapore does that unilaterally, nobody's going to pay much attention. If the whole region of you know, a couple of 100 million is doing it, then people that produce these goods listen, and that's really what happened in Europe. Yeah, it's that scale. The EU experience, so, you know, they can't deliver a raft of directives, legally binding ones, but they could try and agree on some and implement policies nationally that are consistent with that. And I think on the energy efficiency side, it's the easiest one to do. Yeah, you obviously come up against opposition from certain local manufacturers of goods, but I mean, you know, I think it's so important, the issue, that, you know, hopefully politically they can overcome that. I'm not a political scientist, so I'm not sure how realistic that is. The other thing is, with the EU experience, is carbon pricing is not enough. It just sends a signal. It helps companies plan when they do investment analysis, but you need other policies. Yeah, and so for the EU and for ASEAN, you know, the bigger the grid is, the easier it's going to be to integrate renewables, energy efficiency policies, RES policies. RES policies were difficult to coordinate at European level. I mean, there was talk of getting rid of feed-in tariffs and everybody having to have green certification markets, and there was huge opposition to that, if I remember rightly. But I think on the energy efficiency, you can do stuff. So yeah, definitely ASEAN has been a laggard in RES, renewables diffusion, RES policies, and carbon pricing. the experience with the EU single market, energy market, has been 2 steps forward, 1 back. Even if you don't have a supernatural legal standing, you can still create supranational regulators. Yeah, they may not have the full weight of law, but they can. If most countries agree to abide by their decisions, then it could definitely accelerate ASEAN integration. Yeah. As I said, one of the things I want to see is understand the structure of these markets. I know Vietnam has recently gone into the process of liberalization from state ownership of the energy sector, and they're going to introduce an energy market. And as I said, if you've got power transmitted across borders and so on, I do think that sending the right price signals is important, and markets can do that. And look, even though I'm sort of pessimistic of where they've got to, that IEA data is really up to 2016. They are very dynamic economies. They're not hamstrung, let's say, by incessant consultation and a whole lot of regulation, which serves its purpose in Western democracies. But if you suddenly need to do something very quickly, they can slow things down. Yeah. You can think of wind farms in Blueskin Bay as a classic example, yeah. And there's less of that, so they can actually move very quickly. And this is something I ran across in the last couple of days, which is commissioned PV, utility scale PV, where Vietnam was nowhere in 2018, and suddenly it's gone for it, and it's overtaken Australia. Yeah. So, and that's what I love about this region. It's just so dynamic, yeah. And so, how can ASEAN really have an energy policy for ASEAN? I think they should. And so if we go back to our transition pathways, at the moment they seem to be having some interconnectors, so that's really transition pathways, adapting the current energy systems. But I think they could achieve something much better if they go for a TP2. They really have an ASEAN Supergrid. Okay, and that's really going to make it a lot easier to green urban and industrial demand. And they do have large urban and industrial demands. And I think the best way to do it is by having potentially common carbon pricing and definitely a single energy market. You might not even need common carbon pricing given where renewables are now. You just let the market get on with it. Yeah, I mean, it's the cheapest option now. What's happening with cost of storage as well makes it a lot easier. And then obviously I say it's a dual strategy because you also want a TP3 because you've got these rural or remotely located populations that still don't have access to electricity. So rather than building expensive lines to them, let them have distributed smart grids in those locations. But at the moment, the policy seems to be much more focused on a TP1 type transition pathway. And that's really it. Yeah, I've zoomed through it in 20 odd minutes, yeah.
Okay. Let's have questions then. Questions?
Yeah, millions.
A million, oh, okay. Blimey.
So this is really interesting because this implies, in the context also of a nationalised industry, which doesn't need to see a return on its investment in coal because it's a national industry. It's not it doesn't have shareholders to pay. Yeah. That kind of growth could enable the decommissioning of coal earlier. Yeah. But also cope with potentially the increased demand that might be mitigated by energy efficiency. So there's your 3 things going on, all in the same place. Yeah. Because otherwise, I can see that the coal assets are leading, well, aren't going to go away. So in effect, the laggard issues have caused these countries, it seems, based on what you said, to be following the wrong path in order to catch up. But this here is suggesting that they can switch quite quickly to an alternative path and not have to worry about the cost of coal. It's just write it off.
So we want to do more research on this because I want to understand in the major countries to what degree the state still controls the energy sector, so I'll be honest with you, I don't know there. But I think that's really, well, there's two things. One of the things is, yes, if you want to transition quickly and you don't want to have to deal with shareholders whinging about losing their money, then having the state take the loss is a lot easier, You socialize the loss of the stranded assets. So in that sense, that allows, let's say, TP1 to happen very quickly. But you want, for TP2, you want markets, You want electricity markets.
That kind of also implies that market is a green market.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
We looked from BNP Paribas report the other day.
Right.
Who's going to put money into fuel, into fossil fuels now?
Right, yeah.
Is it worth it?
Yeah.
No return.
Yeah.
And sorry, the other thing I was going to say was, because this has corollaries with the UK, so your graph at the start of GDP growth versus carbon reduction is pretty much to do with energy efficiency and switching off coal.
Yeah.
And the UK is actually running out of road on that.
Yeah.
Switched off.
Yeah. I forgot to put in their mixes, but they do have a lot of coal. And look, so I think the first 40% is definitely the easiest. And then it does get a lot harder. There's no question about it. Because then you're talking about, once you've got coal out, then you need to start having harder gas, But with gas, the issue with stranded asset, what's the lifetime of a gas plant? 25 years, is it? Yeah. Versus coal is what, 40, 50 years,
I think gas is convertible to hydrogen. And there are a number of companies who find it easier to put themselves into the supply of hydrogen markets. ASEAN will be well placed to be a consumer.
I mean, so I think cold countries like the UK and New Zealand are going to obviously need a liquid fuel like hydrogen for cold winters, but these countries are pretty warm, so
but cooling is the major factor.
Well, that's what I'm saying, but solar can handle an awful lot of that, So you don't need as much stored energy as you would in cold countries. I mean, hydrogen can definitely play a role, but
so just wondering, so all your results, I was just trying to figure out in my head that you were talking mostly about electricity.
Yeah, so I think it's transition, so electrification,
But some of your graphs for like CO2 emissions, they must be.
So that includes transport, Yeah. So it's all fuels burning, all primary fuels.
Presumably to industrial heat as well.
Right.
So I guess, do the conclusions change when you start thinking about some of the, because you were talking about smart grids quite a lot in electricity markets and integration in that way, but I mean that's not necessarily possible with industrial heat, for example.
Right.
I was just trying to think about it in my head what it meant. I mean, maybe it's electrification is the obvious opportunity there
for industrial heat. Yeah, I mean, we're talking about it here in New Zealand. I mean, those of you that are grey, as grey as I am, and you think about the LNG market. I mean, how quickly that came about. So you could have an equivalent thing with hydrogen. I mean, it was nowhere, 20 odd years ago.
So bringing it back to New Zealand then, what is it? I mean, we don't have this sort of opportunity to be at scale like what you're suggesting for these Southeast Asia countries.
So I think if you're talking about policies, these sort of policies, I think we adopt policies from other parts of the world, and that makes it really easy for do we adopt product policies from the EU? That's what I would do. I mean, you can't do it overnight. You can't say by the end of the year we're going to have a building code equivalent to Europe. Nobody would be building. It would have a bigger even housing crisis than we have now. But I think if you give markets a signal, like by 10 years' time. And so I think there's lessons here for New Zealand. Yeah, I mean, we've had a carbon price, and that's until recently. So we obviously had the announcement on rental properties. Yeah, you actually now need some amazing roof insulation. Go for it. Yeah. So we obviously have the scheme for EVs coming in. Seems like, given what's happened in Europe. So
that's the place to focus.
Well, this stuff happened 20 years ago.
So any further questions?
No? I'm just, oh, you go. I'm just curious about, I think it was Philippines and someone else that had those dramatic spikes in terms of wind energy production, and I can't remember what the other one was. What's going on there, and does that relate? What's driving that?
So it'll be policies, yeah. Philippines, so where were we? 2012, a policy was introduced. 2014. You see a spike.
So it is all that feed-in tariff policy.
Yeah. And one of the reasons is that it gives investors confidence. Yeah, more than anything. So the investors could make the numbers work, but they would be nervous, about maybe going into these countries, and this helps them reduce the cost of capital, that sort of thing.
Yeah. So I guess my question is, why was that a feasible policy for those countries and not others?
It's a good question. So as I said, I got this, Irina. We got as far as highlighting which ones they are, and I think the next step is to really get to the details and how strong these feed-in tariffs are.
Understanding that context, that you can imagine, okay, if these things clearly work, why isn't it being done in Indonesia? On that massive market?
As I said, I think increasingly you might not need incentives, a huge amount of incentives, because you've also all of a sudden got investors wanting to invest in these sort of things. So, you have a growth in green bonds and people wanting to invest in green bonds, because I think you now have 90 trillion worth of investment managers signed up to the United Nations Principles of Responsible Investing, which means they have to take climate change, environment when they're investing. So the biggest thing they'll say to you, these large institutional investors, is they don't have the products. Yeah, and so this, to me, it's a sort of region where, if you get the right deal makers, you could have the right products for these investors, and it could be renewable. So I'd be really curious. So there's no policy there from Vietnam that I can see. And what's caused this? And I bet you it's sort of impact investing. It'll be there'll be some sort of financing behind it. It could also be that because the Vietnamese government has agreed to liberalize its markets, and investors feel like they're no longer at the mercy of the state, giving them a fixed price, and then they're going to get. But I think there's a tension here, and I haven't really figured it out, because on the stranded asset side, it's sort of convenient that government is there to pick up the bill. But if you really want the interconnections, and if you want the investment, then I think investors probably want markets that they can relate to, or maybe they I mean, a lot of installed capacity is being auctioned rather than feed-in tariffs. So maybe this was an auction. Yeah.
So Raf, you had a question?
I think I was just interested. You mentioned that you didn't think carbon pricing would make much of a difference, or wasn't really necessary.
Yeah. Well, I'm just thinking, if you know what's happening with the cost of renewables, they're sort of below fossil, most fossil fuels in like, at least in the US, solar and wind. In Mexico, there was recently an auction. So if the environment, if investors like the environment, so they feel like they're protected, they're not going to have their assets expropriated. Actually, the technology is cheap enough to do it. Yeah. One of the reasons that you might need in ASEAN countries stuff like feed-in tariffs and maybe a carbon price is because they're nervous about property rights and that sort of thing. But if you get all that right, then actually you may need very few incentives, if any. Yeah.
Sure. And you think clearly that the efficiency policy kind of approach is more effective than like a reasonable carbon pricing, like not $4 a ton.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah, totally. I mean, I think for ASEAN, for New Zealand, in terms of our houses, our cars, minimum fuel standards, that's going to have a much bigger impact than a carbon price of 100.
Sure.
I mean, we still have traditional light bulbs on our shelves.
Yeah. So do we know why? I mean, if you have a simple model and you just tweak the numbers, right, it should have an equivalent effect. But why does a direct policy on energy efficiency? I mean, I guess I can see that, but how do we I guess convince the economists who say, if I put it into my model this carbon price, everything, things change. Whereas,
I mean, as I said, carbon prices they're useful for planning. Yeah. So if you're doing an investment appraisal, you can have it in there. But if you suddenly make sure every house, is a certain size, has a roof, has to have a solar panels, like they've done in California, you're going to have a much bigger effect than just a pure incentive.
How do the energy costs compare across the different countries?
That's a good question.
In terms of parity, purchasing parity.
That would be a really nice thing to
obviously, it's the consumer who's driving the incentives they're driven by, and the politics are driven by the consumer costs rather than absolute costs.
Yeah, and that would be really interesting, because if there's big disparities, then there's great incentives to interconnect. Well, mixed incentives to interconnect. Some people will definitely want to interconnect.
Okay, well, I think we might wrap it up there, and thanks a lot, Ivan. Thanks also for stepping in when we...
Last minute, sorry, it was last minute, so apologies about that.
So, thank you.